been a while since I've covered a new device from Powkiddy, which ironically was the RGB30, and in many ways, the new RGB20SX is the vertical alternative to that handheld. The RGB20SX comes with the same 1:1 aspect ratio display, and a Rockchip RK3566, which was also found in the RGB30, but is an interesting mashup of another popular Powkiddy handheld, the RGB20S with its cute stickers, happy face, and vertical design. Now the RGB30 is actually one of my favorite handhelds from Powkiddy, and I'm pretty excited to check out this device that both feels familiar and different. I think many fans of the vertical form factor will find a lot to like here. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore everything the RGB20SX has to offer. There's no need to dwell, we'll find out if going vertical is the way to excel. Let's talk about specs first, and there's going to be a lot of similarities here to Powkiddy's own RGB30, which I covered back in November of last year. The RGB20SX has the same 4-inch 1:1 aspect ratio OCA laminated display with a resolution of 720 by 720. Likewise, it is powered by the Rockchip RK3566 at a frequency of 1.8 GHz with the Mali G52MP2 GPU and includes 1GB of LPDDR4 RAM. The RGB20SX ships with a 16GB microSD card that stores the operating system, but also has a secondary microSD slot for storage expansion to add games. We have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on board with a 3.5mm headset port, a mini HDMI out for video, and 2 USB Type-C ports. The USB-C port does not support C-to-C charging in my testing and does require a 5V 2A power adapter. There is a 5000 mAh battery included, and Powkiddy claims up to 10 hours of battery life with an average charge time of about 2.5 hours. We will be testing battery life later on in this video. Finally, my RGB20SX arrived with JELOS out of the box, and we do have support for Rocknix and ArcOS with the RGB20SX. The Powkiddy RGB20SX is available now for about $80 for the configuration that ships with just the 16GB OS card. There are additional versions for sale with preloaded games, which will cost a bit more. I'd like to thank LitNXT for sending me this unit that I have in hand for the purpose of this video. As I always require, they did not review this video prior to publishing. So let's get all of our Powkiddy stickers out and unbox this RGB20SX, which has the most interesting box art that I have seen for one of these retro handhelds. I'm not entirely sure what's going on here. Is Powkiddy fighting themselves? Is it red versus blue? Do I need to keep waiting for this box art to load the rest of the contents? I don't know, but someone went hard on this. Looking around the box, and it's mostly bare with, of course, the color options on one side. We have black, white, orange, and the color that I received, which is the blue transparent. Alright, let's get this top cover off so we can peek inside, and first things first, it does look like LitNXT provided a 128GB microSD card, which is preloaded with some games. As I mentioned earlier, you can purchase the RGB20SX without any additional game cards. I usually recommend going with that approach so you can curate your own library and then also use your own high quality microSD cards. Okay, time to remove the foamy protective insert, which reveals the beautiful blue transparent RGB20SX peeking through, but we have to examine the rest of the contents first before we can do a proper reveal. We've got a standard plastic tray which holds the handheld securely. I'll just toss that aside. Okay, diving into the rest of the package, we have the included USB-C to USB-A cable, and I'm just going to continue adding this to my growing pile of these cables. And of course, what we're all here for, the included stickers that you place on the front of the handheld. This time around, Powkiddy has a new design for us to enjoy, and I know many were fans of this particular feature on the RGB20S. Finally, we have the RGB20SX instruction sheet, which does detail some important hotkeys that can be used, and it's worth glancing over for that functionality. It's time for some baggy ASMR. And just look at this awesome blue transparent shell. I'm really loving this color. I think it looks great with that white motherboard peeking through the shell. Now in my hands and compared to the RGB30, I am immediately noticing and appreciating this nice grip that we get because of the shoulder button stack in the back. But Let's do a quick tour around the RGB20SX and get familiar with the features on board first. Let's start at the top of the device, and this is where we have the mini HDMI out. And moving to the left side, we have the power and reset buttons. Right below that, we have one of the two micro SD slots. The left side slot is for an additional micro SD card to store games. Now at the bottom of the unit, we have both USB-C ports as well as the 3.5mm headset port. Moving now to the right side, and here we have that second micro SD slot, which will contain the 16GB micro SD already populated with the operating system. Right above this, we have the volume up and down buttons. Let's now check out the backside, and the most noticeable aspect here is the shoulder stack with the L1, L2, R1, and R2 all available here. These are buttons and not triggers, and they are nicely curved to accommodate your fingers when holding the device. The buttons don't have much movement, and as a result don't rattle too much, but they do have an audible clickiness to them. The shoulder stack here actually gives the RGB20SX a nice and comfortable grip when holding it. From the side, we can see that the R2 and L2 are slightly raised so that when you're holding it, you can clearly tell which button you are pressing down on. Now on the front, we have that 4-inch 1:1 display, and it's definitely a bit awkward looking given that it's not quite proportionate to the bottom where the controls are. The bezels here have no branding of any kind. Let's move in closer and take a look at the D-pad, and this is very much reminiscent of the RGB20S and RGB30. The D-pad has a pretty nice movement with a good pivot from each end, and we can see this clearly from the side view. It does have a slight mushiness to it when pressing down, but I do like the way this one feels, and it's easily one of Powkiddy's better D-pads. In the center, between the D-pad and the face buttons, we have the single speaker, and then to the right of that, the face buttons in the BAYX configuration. These are membrane based and press down really well with a good amount of travel and responsiveness. They have a bit of movement, so there's a slight noise when pressing down on them quickly or hard. From the side, we can see that very solid travel. Below the single speaker, we have the start, select, and function buttons. These are using micro switches, and so they press down differently and sound different compared to the other face buttons. Finally, we have two switch-style analog sticks, and these are slightly recessed into the shell, so they are not sticking out, which we can see when holding the device at a different angle. Alright, let's go ahead and power on the RGB20SX for the first time and see what we have going on here. It looks like we have JELOS included here with a build from March 14th. And I did talk to some of my fellow YouTubers, and it does seem there are versions of the RGB20SX shipping with either Rocknix or ArcOS, so just be aware of that if you are planning on purchasing the RGB20SX. I've always liked the interface of JELOS for these devices. It's clean and it works mostly well. Now I've added that 128GB game card that Lit NXT sent over, and so JELOS has automatically populated the platforms, and there's a ton of stuff here. If we press start, we have access to a bunch of different settings here. I will not be going in depth here as it does appear that different units ship with different operating systems. Now one thing that is nice is that we do have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on board, so things like retro achievements will be possible with the RGB20SX. In addition, because we have JELOS or even Rocknix and ArcOS, we do have access to things like Portmaster, which expands on the kinds of games that we can play on a device like this, but personally for me, the RGB20SX is not necessarily the ideal device for those kind of games, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Alright, so let's grab some numbers on the RGB20SX, and as usual, I have a few friends that are joining in on this section. I always love this as an opportunity to talk about other devices, but namely, I went with devices that for me are ideal to be replaced by the RGB20SX, and so we have a lot of vertical handhelds here, including the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, as well as the sibling to the RGB20SX, the RGB30. First up, let's get the weight on the RGB20SX, which comes in at 220 grams or a little under 8 ounces. Next, we have the other Powkiddy device with that 1:1 display, but in a horizontal format, the RGB30, and this comes in just slightly lighter than the RGB20SX at 203 grams or a little over 7 ounces. Here's the big chunker, the original Game Boy, which weighs in at 334 grams or just shy of 12 ounces. And now the awesome atomic purple Game Boy Color, which weighs 216 grams or a little bit over 7.5 ounces. So let's size up some of these handhelds, and first I'll compare the RGB20SX to the RGB30, which I think for many is the most obvious comparison, since they have the same screens but in a different form factor. Amazingly, these two devices are very similar in their actual size, and it's truly like someone took an RGB30 and turned it sideways. Now there are some differences when it comes to the thickness, as the RGB20SX has shoulder buttons on the back as well as that bump out for the battery, but it is very thin at the top where the display resides. Whereas the RGB30 has a flat back that uses inline shoulder buttons at the top and is slightly thicker overall compared to the thinnest portion of the RGB20SX. Another thing I was very curious about was the sizes of the face buttons and D-pad between these two units, since at least to my eye they look very similar and most likely are sharing the same setup, which is not a bad thing at all, as I really enjoy the controls on the RGB30. So the face buttons on the RGB30 come in at about 7.9mm, and unsurprisingly, the RGB30's face buttons measure in at an identical 7.9mm, and so these are definitely the same buttons being reused here for the RGB20SX. Let's now measure the width of the D-pad, and on the RGB20SX, this comes in at about 21.5mm, and likewise on the RGB30, this comes in at the same measurement. Now let's bring in the Game Boy, and this is a substantial device, and it's so much fun seeing the RGB20SX next to this device, and it really shows how far technology has come. The Game Boy is slightly larger overall than the RGB20SX, but it's a much thicker device than the RGB20SX. The Game Boy's face buttons are about 10mm, and so they are larger than what we get on the Powkiddy. But the D-pad on the Game Boy is smaller, but it is also thicker on the inside portion. Let's now bring in the Game Boy Color, which is a smaller device overall compared to the RGB20SX. Okay, so it's time to talk about the build quality, and this has always been an area that can go either way with a Powkiddy device, and generally I found the device to be built pretty well. The plastic here, at least for this transparent model, is very nice and it does feel really good in the hands. Now during my usual bend test, I did notice that the screen was separating at the bottom left corner, and so it's something that one should be mindful of in case it's a consistent issue. The small touches here are particularly nice with the white motherboard that can be seen through the transparent shell. The device doesn't make a significant rattling sound, and for the most part, everything is pretty tight and solid. Now easily one of the highlights of this device, and probably one of the main reasons that someone might consider it, would be the high resolution 1:1 aspect ratio panel that Powkiddy is now using for the second time. It's funny because I knew what to expect with the display because of the RGB30, and yet when I unboxed and turned on the RGB20SX and loaded up a game for the first time, I still wowed at the display and just admired how great the picture is on here. There's no doubt about it, this is a gorgeous panel, and in particular when using it for something like Gameboy Color and Pico 8, the images just look so crispy and sharp. I can't get enough of this display, and it's truly one of those moments that makes you appreciate how far we've come since the original Game Boy days. The viewing angles are excellent at any angle, my particular unit didn't have any issues with backlight bleeding, and this display gets very bright at its highest setting, with nice scaling down to a lower level for nighttime gaming. Now, a difference coming from the RGB30 is the removal of a secondary speaker, and instead, with the RGB20SX, and similar to the RGB20S, we only have a single speaker here. And for me personally, this isn't too much of an issue. Again, my specific use case for this device has been mostly centered around platforms like the Game Boy Color and Pico 8, and so for those specific platforms, the single speaker does more than a good enough job, and despite the single speaker, I found it to be loud enough and still quite clear at higher audio levels. Let's listen for a moment to some Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Alright, let's talk a little bit about the D-pad here, and just the controls in general. I really do like the setup here, and it's a definite improvement over the RGB20S, especially in terms of comfort. The button and D-pad feel are very similar to the RGB30, which I found to be quite good and responsive. And not much has changed here with the RGB20SX. I am able to move all around the screen quite well in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, as well as being able to pull off combos in succession without much issue. This is definitely excellent for fighting game fans, but I did want to test this out a bit more in games that require a little more precision since this is a pretty responsive D-pad. And that can be both a good and bad thing, but even in a game like Celeste for the Pico 8, I didn't find myself struggling, and it really just came down to a skill issue whenever I failed spectacularly in the game. This is overall one of Powkiddy's better devices when it comes to controls, and I definitely rank it up there with some of their best work. So it's now time for my favorite portion of the video, which of course is the teardown, and it looks like the RGB20SX is ready to go as it's hiding away in my iFixit kit. And of course, as we always do, we're gonna first size up that bit so we can get that back cover removed. And looking at the back, we do have 6 screws that need to be removed. These are using just standard Phillips screws, so I'll go ahead and grab a Phillips size 00 bit, which seems to work nicely here, and I'll go ahead and quickly remove these 6 screws. With the screws off, it should be pretty simple to remove this back cover, and yeah, the cover comes right off, but before we do that, as we can clearly see, there is a battery connected to the back cover here, so just be careful when you take the back cover off to not just pry it right off, since it is going to be connected to that main board. And then, of course, carefully disconnect the cable that is connected to the main board, and now we can take a look at this back cover. So with the back cover completely off, you can see that the plastic itself is quite flexible, and I'm honestly not all too surprised by that. Now, one of the first things I actually noticed immediately was that there's actually these thin pads that are on the shoulder buttons, which helps with some of the sound absorption of the device, and again, really interesting to see Powkiddy spending some time making very small touches to the hardware. And of course, we can get a look at this 5000 mAh battery that's included here, and beyond that, there's not a whole lot of other things to talk about here on this back cover. I gotta say, I really like the look of the white mainboard, and here is our centered shot of that board, with that Rockchip RK3566 completely visible here. Another thing that's nice and worth noting is that the processor actually is nowhere near the battery, and so we really don't have to worry about heat being exposed to either the battery or processor. This will definitely help the RGB20SX feel comfortable in the hands. Let's get a closer look at the micro switches that are being used for the shoulder buttons on the back. These are actually pretty quiet, and with those contact pads definitely help the sound of those shoulder buttons when it's all put back together. Now at the bottom, we can see the 2 analog sticks, which are easily removable and only connected to the mainboard by a cable that is both accessible and easy to disconnect. This is great for someone that might be considering to do a mod where the sticks are removed for the RGB20SX. There's another visible cable here which connects to the back of the board, and this is for the single speaker at the front. So let's get the analog stick cables, display, and speaker cable all disconnected and prepared to remove the mainboard from the shell. Make sure to remove any micro SD cards that are in the slots. It looks like we have 4 Phillips screws holding the board in place, and we can continue to use the same size bit here to remove them. With all the screws removed, the board will lift up from the shell, so just go slowly here. I used a tool to help wedge between the shell and board to give it a bit of a lift up. We can now get a look at the other side of the mainboard and get a closer look at the micro switches that are being used for the select, start, and function buttons. You will also notice that there is a small piece of material here to help filter out some of the light that shines through the transparent shell. Everything here is really clean and looks good overall. I don't really see anything that stands out. So let's grab the shell now and take a look at the membranes being used here, as well as the D-pad and face buttons. We can hear some of that rattle that comes from some of the buttons here because of their movement in the shell. Interestingly, looking at the function keys on the front, and Powkiddy has placed down a piece of material to help minimize the sound of those buttons being pressed, but they are still quite loud. Let's grab the membrane and take a closer look, and we can see that really nice travel that we are getting with these, which explains why the face buttons feel pretty nice. And here's a look at the D-pad with that really defined center post, which explains why it has a pretty solid pivot. Finally, here's a look at the face buttons and the way they are keyed here. You will notice that B and A are easily swappable, but X and Y are not, since you will have to place X sideways in order to change its placement in the shell, unless you modify the keying, which is simple enough to do. Okay, so it's now time to finally talk about emulation with the RGB20SX, and if you've been in the retro handheld space for a bit, the Rockchip RK3566 isn't a new chip in the space and has been seen in multiple devices, including Powkiddy's own RGB30. Generally, we have a good idea of the performance that we can expect to see here, but the RGB20SX is a bit unique since it does have that 1:1 aspect ratio display, and therefore, much like I did with my RGB30 video, I want to first focus on the platforms that I think are truly the best suited for a device like this. I'll then discuss the less ideal scenarios at the end of the emulation showcase, but at least take the time to demonstrate the capabilities of the RK3566 in this RGB20SX. Without a doubt, one of the best use cases for the RGB20SX and its 1:1 display is going to be Game Boy and Gameboy Color. Both platforms utilize an aspect ratio that is very close to the 1:1 display that we have here with the RGB20SX. And in many ways, the RGB20SX being a vertical device makes it feel like the perfect fit to emulate these beloved handhelds. Out of the box, at least with my RGB20SX and its build of JELOS, I was a bit disappointed that the pre-configured shaders for the RGB20SX was not one of the best that utilized this awesome display that we have here on the device. In contrast, my RGB30 had a much better setup out of the box for Game Boy specifically, which I definitely found interesting as it also had JELOS out of the box. Of course, it's not too difficult to go into RetroArch and change the settings to your liking, but I thought it was worth noting as many do like just turning on their devices and playing without the need to tweak, and Game Boy is definitely one of those platforms that you're gonna want to play on this RGB20SX. But once I got things configured to the way I like, I could load up some Game Boy favorites like Dr. Mario, Super Mario Land 2, and Metroid 2 and just have a blast playing through my consistent Game Boy favorites. The RGB20SX and even the RGB30 present a fun opportunity to explore the vast Game Boy library, which contains tons of hidden gems, and there's really so many I could recommend, like Trip World and Kid Dracula. And then we have the Game Boy Color, which was exciting at the time since it finally marked the first time that the Game Boy line featured a color screen, and seeing those Game Boy Color games come to life on the RGB20SX with its vivid display that also features a backlight really makes you appreciate yet again how far we have come. The Game Boy Color was configured a bit better out of the box, and outside of it being forced to utilize the full 1:1 aspect ratio, the shader used here is much better suited for the Game Boy Color, and out of the box I did really like the way the Game Boy Color games looked here. As always, my biggest problem when revisiting a certain platform's library of games is just getting hooked on some of my favorites again, and spending way more time than I should be during this process. I load up one of my all-time favorite Game Boy Color games, Mario Tennis, which has this awesome RPG type mode that makes it more than just a tennis game, and spent an entire evening in bed playing through it way past my bedtime. Despite the short lifespan of the Game Boy Color, this is a platform that has tons of gems, and with modern displays, we can really enjoy the beautiful colors that the Game Boy Color provided, which can now be fully seen and enjoyed. And another handheld that was released not too long after the Game Boy Color, the Geo Pocket Color, which, like the Game Boy Color, did not have a backlit screen, and so despite being in color, it suffered the same issues with it being fairly difficult to see outside of direct light. The Geo Pocket Color is another platform that truly benefits from today's technology to allow it to fully come through and shine. And this is a handheld that holds a special place for me, notably for the awesome clicky joystick that the handheld had, and there were some truly great games made for the platform. Now, I've never been the biggest fighting game fan, which of course is a bit ironic given that we're talking about SNK, but there are a couple of gems that I absolutely adore, like Metal Slug First and Second Missions, Sonic the Hedgehog Pocket Adventure, and SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters Clash. If you're not familiar with Geo Pocket Color, I definitely recommend diving into its library a bit as it does have some real gems. The Geo Pocket Color is another great fit for the 1:1 aspect ratio display, since the Geo Pocket Color was another handheld that utilized a screen that had almost a perfectly square screen, and it's actually closer to that aspect ratio than even the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color. On my RGB20SX, this was also configured to stretch to that full 1:1, and so if you want to maintain the correct aspect ratio, you will need to adjust the setting, and you will probably notice just how close it really is to that 1:1 display with it having minimal letterboxing. Now, we talked about Nintendo and SNK, but how about some Sega with the Game Gear? And the Game Gear actually utilized an identical aspect ratio and resolution as the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and again, it's a great use of the RGB20SX's 1:1 aspect ratio display. Now, like most of the platforms here, out of the box, it was configured to stretch to that 1:1 aspect ratio, and so you will need to yet again adjust the aspect ratio to the correct one if you are a stickler about that. Regardless, what we get here is an immense improvement to the original backlit display that the Game Gear had, and it's kind of amazing how awful it is in comparison to the modern tech that we have today. Even here with my awesome modded Game Gear, I'd still much prefer to play Game Gear on the RGB20SX, since the display is absolutely gorgeous, and of course it's a lot smaller and more portable. The Game Gear is another very interesting library to explore, and while it did receive a lot of Master System ports, it did receive its own library of exclusives, and some of those games are real gems that are well worth playing. My personal favorite since I was a child has been Tails Adventure, but there's lots of other great games that I've discovered over the years, like the Genesis to Game Gear ports with Streets of Rage 2 and Gunstar Heroes. Oh, and then there's also one of the coolest racing games on the Game Gear with Sonic Drift 2, and yes, you need to play it. Now, an often overlooked platform has to be the Watara Supervision. And I know for the handful of diehard fans, they are probably ecstatic since this is a very rare opportunity for the Watara Supervision to shine in the spotlight. But the reality is that the Supervision is a great fit for the RGB20SX, since the Supervision actually had a perfect 1:1 aspect ratio display, and so it fits nicely here with the display on hand with the SX. The irony here is that this is probably the best that these games have played and looked, and so if you're unfamiliar with the Watara's Supervision, it presents as an opportunity to learn a bit about some video game history, as the Supervision was a pretty interesting device that was a very budget competitor to the original Game Boy. The hardware itself hasn't held up too well, and really, there aren't an abundance of these devices around, so from a preservation standpoint, this is a pretty neat thing to explore, and that's always part of the joy with these retro handheld devices. And of course, we have to talk about Pico 8, which is probably my favorite use case for a device like the RGB20SX. In many ways, this handheld feels like it was made for Pico 8, and the two really are a match made in heaven. The incredible screen that we get here with the 20SX really allows you to appreciate the tasty pixels on display with the Pico 8 games. Not only that, but the SX natively supports Spore, and so Pico 8 compatibility is excellent with the SX. This was easily one of my favorite things to do with the RGB30, and yet again the same holds true for the RGB20SX. The 1:1 aspect ratio is a perfect match for Pico 8 games, and for anyone that is a fan of the platform, I really do think you'd be hard-pressed to find a more enjoyable way to play the great library of Pico 8 games. Outside of Gameboy Color, Pico 8 was the platform that I've spent most of my time enjoying on the SX, and I don't think much will change with that in the future. For vertical handheld lovers, you finally can enjoy what many have already loved about the RGB30, but in this vertical format that the SX provides. It was actually one of the first things I did with my device when I received it and loaded up my massive library of Pico 8 games, and of course gravitated to all of my favorites like Sweet Buns and Cosmic Collapse. And yet again, it was an opportunity for me to explore more of the Pico 8 library and discover new favorites like Birds with Guns and 1948 Assault on Pico. Hands down, if you enjoy Pico 8, the RGB20SX will not disappoint. So let's continue talking about additional use cases for this unique display, and another area that is interesting to explore is 8.7 content with platforms like the Super Nintendo, which I'll leave up to you since I know this has been a topic for a long time in the retro community. But as always, I just like to present ideas and options here, and so it's definitely something worth considering, and obviously the RGB20SX will have no issues playing the Super Nintendo library. And while we are on the topic of power, the RGB20SX and the RK3566 can handle quite a bit more than just playing back your favorite Game Boy games, and so you can easily enjoy the PlayStation 1 library without much issue as well. On the Dreamcast side, you will definitely be able to enjoy a portion of the library, but keep your expectations in mind since while a good portion plays quite well here, there are games that will not, without the need for frame skipping or a reduction in resolution. Regardless, Dreamcast is still quite solid here, and in general this is content that was designed for a 4:3 aspect ratio, so we will be getting much larger letterboxing. Now something that's interesting to consider is that if you take the RGB20S for example, and compare its viewable image size to the RGB20SX when displaying 4:3 content, you will notice that it's nearly identical, and so despite losing out on a lot of the usable display, we are still getting essentially a 3.5-inch 4:3 image on the 4-inch 1:1 display of the RGB20SX. Finally, let's talk about PlayStation Portable, which I saved for last, since for me personally, I think this is the least appealing use case for a device like the RGB20SX. PSP games were designed for 16:9 and therefore have massive letterboxing on a display like the one found on here. It's also a platform that while lighter games can easily be enjoyed on here, the harder to run games will struggle, and so between the lack of power and the massive letterboxing, I'd say PSP is an interesting bonus with the RGB20SX, but definitely should not be your primary focus. And as always, how does the Powkiddy RGB20SX fare when it comes to battery life? And of course, I loaded up some Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo with the brightness set to 50% and volume at about 30% with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned on, and the device managed more than 8 hours and 45 minutes of on-screen time, which is quite good. Now with JELOS, the device had issues with the battery indicator showing that it was at 0% battery life for about an hour and a half before it actually died. Now just using the device for the past 3 weeks or so, I have definitely experienced the battery indicator being very inaccurate, and I'd get low battery warnings or incorrect readings all the time. This is definitely an issue that has been pretty consistent with a lot of these Linux-based devices, but in particular, it's been pretty noticeable with the RGB20SX. It doesn't necessarily impact its performance as the battery does provide the appropriate runtime, it's just annoying when you're never really sure if the percentage on screen is correct, or when that flashing light comes on, even though there's still plenty of runtime left. Now, I have not fully tested this in ArcOS or Rocknix, so I cannot confirm if the readings are an issue over there on those other options. One other test I conducted was checking thermals, and during the teardown I commented that the battery and processor are completely separate from each other because of the design of the RGB20SX, and so I definitely think thermals are going to be pretty good here. Now, taking a look at the actual numbers, and it's pretty interesting since on the lower part of the display area we have the highest recorded temperatures on the device, pushing as much as 49 degrees Celsius. And I would have never noticed it if it weren't for the reading, and when I placed my hands there I could definitely feel the heat. The good news is that you won't be placing your hands here, and so looking at the temperatures in the controls area, and it does drop quite significantly, staying mostly at 30 degrees Celsius. On the back of the display, temperatures were about 40 degrees Celsius, and so it's much cooler on the back side, and then we have these same temperatures on the back of the controls area at around 30 degrees Celsius. And so, what if you're an owner of the RGB30? Well, there's not a whole lot different here. The reality is that we still get a lot of those Powkiddy quirks that still make its way over to the RGB20SX. When comparing the RGB30 to the 20SX, the real decision to be made here is over the form factor. And again, if you're an owner of the RGB30 and wish you could have this awesome 1:1 display in a vertical format, the RGB20SX does exactly that. And of course, if you're a vertical form factor fan and held off because of the RGB30's horizontal form, then the RGB20SX is the device for you. I will say that I am usually someone that enjoys horizontal form factor handhelds, but the RGB20SX immediately grew on me because of how comfortable it is to play games on. The shoulder stack in the back actually is great for giving a solid grip on the handheld, and the placement of the D-pad and face buttons make this a pretty comfortable device, especially when compared to the very squared off shape of the RGB30, which has a flat back and therefore nothing really to grip onto. Now, for what I use both devices for, I actually don't need the shoulder buttons or even the analog sticks, and so I'm strictly comparing the vertical versus horizontal form, and for me, the RGB20SX wins out. There's one more handheld that I wanted to compare against, and if you take a look at the RGB20SX, you'll notice that it's this weird combination of the RGB30 and another very popular Powkiddy device that I covered before on this channel, the TikTok famous RGB20S, which looks similar to the RGB20SX, but there are notable differences, and one of the key differences for me is the placement of the controls, which I find to be far superior on the RGB20SX. I am glad that Powkiddy moved the analog sticks to the bottom, which for the type of device the RGB20SX is and what most will probably play on it, doesn't become the focal point of the handheld, since only a few platforms will truly need that analog stick, and so it's nice that it's at the bottom and kind of out of the way. The overall build quality has also improved since the RGB20S days, and there are small refinements here that definitely make the RGB20SX feel like a much nicer device. Interestingly, comparing the two, and it does appear that Powkiddy decided to further recess the analog sticks on the 20SX, which isn't a bad thing as I find that it's not in the way, and given that I'm personally using this for things like Pico 8 and Gameboy Color, the sticks being recessed more on the 20SX is definitely a good thing. Now, another thing that's very interesting when comparing to the RGB20S, and something I mentioned earlier, is that this device has a 4.3 3.5-inch display. And again, if you notice over on the RGB20SX, when we play 4.3 content, the image is essentially identical to the RGB20S's screen size. And so if you were considering the RGB20SX over the RGB20S, you will find that playing games with a different aspect ratio doesn't actually translate into a loss of image size. And so I really do think that if it were a decision between the two here, the RGB20SX is the way to go, which also provides a bit more power. And so I think it's time to wrap things up here, and I have to say that the RGB20SX actually surprised me quite a bit. Now, on one hand, I was excited to check it out since I really enjoyed the RGB30, and up until the release of the RGB20SX, it was one of my favorite ways to enjoy Game Boy, Neo Geo Pocket, Game Gear, and Pico 8 content. But with the jump to the vertical format, I find that the overall comfort is an improvement, and definitely makes it worth considering against the RGB30. Like many Powkiddy devices, it definitely has its fair share of quirks, which is something the RGB30 had as well. But if you can accept some of its shortcomings, the RGB20SX is one of the nicest ways to enjoy the type of content that I mentioned earlier, but in a vertical format with a display that is still some of the best I've seen in the retro handheld space, especially under the $100 price point. And amazingly, it won't be long before we see another option jump into the space, as Anbernic is getting ready to drop their RG Cube with the same 1.1 720p panel. It will be interesting to see how it will fare against the Powkiddy devices. But until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.